Hello, everyone. I am back at it this week as it slowly manifests and shows me, but I know that it begins the video right away, and so I am beginning talking right away and also silencing my phone while it brings up all the various features that are part of this. Or maybe it didn't begin right away. Now it's showing me 7 seconds in. Anyway, alas, Facebook is moving slowly. I'm not entirely clear when the video began, so it's probably clipped and thus unprofessional. But that's okay. This isn't a professional enterprise, although I am definitely someone who prides himself on doing all the diligence of research that would be required of an academic professional. So, just to begin, while people are logging in, I will go over my standard beginning because it is that important, as I say every week. My name is Joseph Solar. I am a professor of history and African American history at Rowan College of Burlington County, and I also teach sociology and literature at other schools. I do these videos as part of a collaboration with a former student of mine, Lauren Purnell, who requested extra opportunities to spread and provide education, particularly in African American history, because recent events have shown us that knowledge of African American history is lacking. And to my argument, not just knowledge of African American history, but knowledge of how much American history is utterly dependent upon understanding the African American experience within it. And this is a major passion of mine. So, one of the things that I always say, and I'll say again, is that we are awash. Hello, Jay, how are you? We are awash in a world of misinformation and lies. The old saying that a lie can travel around the world several times while the truth is still getting on its boots is unbelievably in evidence in today's society. And as a consequence, hi Michelle, one of the things that I like to convey to my viewers is that we must always question sources of information and facts of information that are provided to us. We should always fact check, even if you all, my regular viewers, have come to trust me at this point. You should still check with me or check on me. As that said, I will point out that I will give you a pile of links that you can check me because, as someone who is very confident in the historic realities that I share with you, I want you to check me because I know that the more that you check me, the more you will see that the facts and interpretations I am advancing are grounded in thorough and effective scholarship. Which, of course, brings me to the other point, which is always consider the person providing you with the information in the first place. And so, as I already mentioned, I am a professor of history. I have my PhD from Temple University in the field of urban education. It's also where I received my master's degree. And my undergraduate education was in history and African American history at Harvard University. I got to study with some of the most incredible, brilliant scholars. And in fact, as I speak today, ringing in my mind will be my one history professor, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, whose husband used to be a federal appeals court judge here in Philadelphia, but that's just an aside. But she will ring in my mind because she is the one who began the education for me in the material I'm covering today. But I studied with not just Higginbotham, who might not be as well known, though she should be. She is the first African American woman ever tenured in the history department at Harvard University because she's awesome. But I studied with her and Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Cornel West and Jamaica Kincaid. Others, James Loran Mattori, who you might not have heard of, Werner Solars. I've studied with some just incredible people, and so it's my duty and my privilege to pass on what I learned from them to you, that you may pass it on to others, and to provide you with as clear and effective critical insights in the material as I hope to provide to you. So, with that all out of the way, got it in under 5 minutes, call that a win. we can talk about cultural racism. And I have a very particular definition of this. So this isn't necessarily a universal definition. This is just the way I interpret certain aspects of history, which I'm going to provide to you today. The previous 2 weeks, I discussed scientific racism, which was the development of whole fields of science, pseudoscience, really, or science of poor scientific method and inquiry that at their heart were meant to justify slavery. And those scientific studies and those scientists in the early fields of anthropology and what they called natural philosophy were awash in a sense of categorizing and understanding and describing the world, but were subject to significant cognitive biases and, of course, with a desire to prove something that they basically already knew, which is cognitive bias, or what we also call motivated reasoning. And so we covered Samuel Morton and his studies of skulls, one of his disciples, Josiah Nott, an Alabama slave planter, and his studies of African people. I mentioned other research and kind of unethical research conducted on enslaved African Americans, and just various aspects of this. So this scientific racism is exceptionally important because it resonated and reverberated through generations of American and ultimately global life. And what started as an attempt to measure the size of a skull in America grew into a eugenics movement which influenced Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust. And so this is what I mean about understanding the deadly seriousness of the situation. But there's another component to this which we have to consider, which is that in the 1830s, most people are not cracking open a copy of Morton's Crania Americana or reading science books or attending lectures at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. And so if one is trying to make the argument that slavery is a moral good, which they began trying to make in the 1820s, a shift from the slavery is a necessary evil argument of the Revolutionary era, how could they make that argument to the masses whose support would be necessary, especially as voting rights are being increasingly granted to larger and larger segments of the white male population? And so this is where cultural racism comes in. And what I mean by cultural racism, it's really more about kind of mass popular culture, is that because most people are not reading scientific journals or attending scientific lectures at the Academy of Natural Sciences, the message that Europeans are a superior race and Africans are an inferior race and Native Americans are an inferior race, and thus we are the peak of civilization and we can take native land because they're not doing right by it, and we can use Africans as enslaved people to work the land for us, is not inconsistent with our Declaration, which said all men are created equal, and our Constitution, which upheld rights of property and due process and all of these other methods and methodologies. So how do we convince the rest of the population of this? Well, something called cultural racism. And the most obvious manifestation, and first disclaimer, I cannot cover all of everything that I want to cover today, or all of it at all. So I'm going to outline some broad sketches and provide you piles of links, including to some documentaries that fill in certain gaps, and just, it's big. It's a huge topic. But the most obvious aspect we think of in terms of cultural racism is the phenomenon of blackface. That situation where usually white people will blacken their faces and perform, usually in a demeaning way, as African Americans. And it is very notable. Oh, hi, Nicole and Cassandra. I didn't see you there. It is very notable that blackface has a very long history, but it wasn't necessarily a demeaning cultural item. Now, let me just kind of flush that in a little bit. If we go back to the early 1600s, around 1601, 1602, 1603. So even before Jamestown, even before the English land in America, William Shakespeare writes a play called Othello. And Othello features a Moor, an African tragic hero, whom Shakespeare describes as black. And so, in performances of Othello, we have evidence that the actor performing the role of Othello would blacken his face. But, like I said, Othello, in Shakespeare's rendering, was the tragic hero of the story. And so, even though they're blacking up their faces to perform this role, Othello wasn't meant to be a demeaning representation. He was heroic. He was tragic. However, there is within Shakespeare's concept already the seeds of something that will manifest and kind of blow up in the cultural racism era. And it relates to this pseudoscience called geohumoral sciences. And that goes all the way the hell back to Hippocrates, the ancient Greek doctor, who argued that the temperament, the humors, the way that we behave in our bodies are influenced by our climate and our environment, and even in our language. Right? If we talk about somebody getting hot under the collar, we're talking about them getting angry and agitated. And Hippocrates argued that the closer people were to the equator and the hotter the climate, the hotter their temperament. And so in Othello, we see Shakespeare represent his closer to the equator character, Othello, as prone to rage and angry because of his his geohumoral programming, because he was African, because he was further south, thus he was more prone to fits of rage. And it manifests in English concepts that, the ultimate ideal was the stiff upper lip, and the calm, cool, and collected person was the manifestation. The person devoid of emotions was ideal because we live further north. And even today, in modern times, Louis Farrakhan, for example, has described Europeans as devil people and ice cold and whatnot because they live in the icy wastes. So going all the way back to ancient Greek original medicines, we have these lines that will come through that are ascientific, that in essence are cultural, right? Shakespeare's not a scientist, he's a cultural guy. So you have this character of Othello. And so we have reports through the generations of people using blackface to play this role and play this character and to represent African people. Gary Nash, I believe, the American Revolution historian, reports of incidents of people wearing blackface during the Revolution to put on shows where they would spoof other cultures. So, yeah, classic tradition, cultural dress-up is an old tradition. Now, just an interesting aside, you have this character Othello who is African, but he would not be played by an African until the 1830s in London. And the man who plays him in the 1830s in London is a man named Ira Aldridge, who was a free-born New Yorker born in 1807, who eventually moves to London because he finds more acceptance as an actor there, and in the 1830s would be the first African in recorded history to perform the role of Othello. However, we would not have an African or an African American play the role of Othello in the United States until the 1940s. And that would be Paul Robeson, Jersey's own Paul Robeson, Rutgers grad, who would play Othello and would be the first African American to play the role of Othello. So think about all that that means in terms of performance and culture, that a role of an African would not be played by an African until 230 years after it was written, and then only in England, but by a New York born actor. And it would not be played in the United States for a further 100 years. And in part, it's because of the development of this cultural racism and this manufactured hysteria about black men preying upon white women. So, where do we begin to see this hysteria? Well, interestingly enough, the year after Ira Aldridge is born in New York, a man named Thomas Dartmouth Rice is born in New York. And he will be the man who will bring to the stage a blackface character whom he will call Jim Crow, who will set off generations of racist blackface cultural demeaning performance. As the story goes from a documentary called Ethnic Notions, and again, I have links and links and links and links and links to go with this. T.D. Rice, as he went by, Thomas Dartmouth Daddy Rice, or T.D. Rice, was a traveling performer back in the growing era of American pop culture, where Americans have slightly more leisure and better transportation. So we have wandering shows, wandering theater troupes, wandering minstrels. And he's one of these performers who would, take the canals and the stagecoaches and well, not the steamboats, not in the 1820s, and the old, the brand new transit systems, and travel the country performing. While on such a trip, and mind you, this is a legend, while on such a trip, he was in Kentucky, and he saw an African American man dancing. And like many enslaved people, the man's clothes were tattered and a wreck because, of course, those slave keepers, one of the things that we can generally fault movies with, and it might be out of necessity and ratings, is that African Americans were not dressed well by their slave enslavers. So this man was wearing raggedy clothes like many enslaved people did, if they even had clothes, which again, we don't often see that, but we have to remember that that was often the case. Just tie a rag around your loins, a loincloth, or throw a sack over your body. So he sees this man dancing, and the man had some sort of a wound or an injury in his leg, and so it was kind of a funny dance. And according to legend, there was a little song that enslaved African Americans had created. Every time I wheel about, I jump just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. And they were talking about wheeling about, turning, as part of the dance, because dancing had been outlawed in the colonies. And so African Americans were not allowed to dance, but the law specified that people dancing and crossing their feet are dancing, and so the Jim Crow dance didn't cross the feet. This is from the documentary Ethnic Notions. And so thus, it was a clever workaround. But T.D. Rice sees this. It's not his traditional upbringing of European dance. This man is in raggedy clothes. The man has like a hitch in his leg of some sort, which added to it. And so T.D. Rice took the man's clothes that night, blackened his face, and impersonated this man. And they call him Jim Crow. People loved the show. And so T.D. Rice begins performing it to packed houses. People want to see this funny performance of Jim Crow. I've heard different accounts, but the earliest account of when he creates this character is 1828, which happens to be the presidential election year when Andrew Jackson gets elected president. And you might remember from a few weeks ago I mentioned that Jackson's political machine was organized around white supremacy. So it's kind of coincidence that Andrew Jackson is running for president on the grounds of white supremacy, using whiteness as a unifying factor to try to bring together a diverse coalition of immigrants, including Catholics and Protestants, the North, the South, the West, etc., using whiteness to kind of override those. And at the same time, T.D. Rice is mocking an enslaved African American. It becomes so popular that other people begin to impersonate Jim Crow. By the 1840s, the show has become a standard in American popular entertainment, but it has grown because now these blackface performers not only perform the Jim Crow character, but they create additional characters, and they come together and create troupes of performers, minstrels. And in fact, Stephen Foster, the famous American musician from Pittsburgh who writes songs like Old Sewanee, My Old Kentucky Home, and these songs, he was a blackface minstrel performer. Sadly, hi sister, my sister's here. Sadly, the more you look at American culture, the more the race just pops up. I always say to my class, you just scratch the surface a little bit and there's racism. So even Stephen Foster, who wrote all these quaint American folk songs, he's a blackface performer. The man who wrote Dixie, Dan Emmett, was a blackface performer, and he was part of the first minstrel show troupe in which a group of people would all come together in blackface. And so they developed these new characters. So Jim Crow, whose characterization was a happy-go-lucky, lazy, enslaved man, right? The idea of this character, or why it resonated, was if one is hearing arguments from abolitionists, slavery is bad, slavery is terrible, slavery is abusive, individuals could watch the Jim Crow show and say, but I saw Jim Crow, and he's happy, and he's singing, and he's dancing, and he doesn't have to work too hard. I don't trust these abolitionists. In other words, they trusted fiction more than they trusted reality, or they trusted something that was presented as fiction more than they trusted something that was presented as reality. They believed the fiction and not the reality. I'll come back to that in a little bit. They develop a new character, Zip Coon. And Zip Coon was supposed to be a free black who lived in the North. He was an African-American man who lived in freedom. And his character was he would dress up in bright colored mismatched patterns, and he would try to lecture on intellectual topics and be unable to understand or convey meaning. And so Zip Coon basically was the flip side, right? Here's Jim Crow, happy-go-lucky, enjoying, singing, performing, living as a slave. Here's Zip Coon, a free man, and he can't handle it. He's unable to rise to the level of civilization that we have attained. And at the time that this is happening, of course, in the 1830s and 40s, there is a growing migration of Catholic mostly, but Irish and German immigrants into America's cities. And it was in America's cities, particularly in the Northeast, places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Cincinnati and even Baltimore, even out south, that competition for jobs existed between the incoming immigrants and the African Americans who had been there for decades. And so hearing about Zip Coon, they're like, see, those people, meaning African Americans, aren't capable of rising to our level, but we, even though we're Catholic, we're Europeans, we are civilized, we are advanced. And so we have this popular show that provides a solution to issues and provides an answer or a reason or a rationale for ongoing discrimination. And what we know happens in northern cities in the 1840s is race riots. And this is where things get complicated, because in Philadelphia, for example, there was a race riot in which Protestant Europeans, English, targeted Irish Catholics and burned down Old St. Mary's Church and attacked their neighborhoods, put the city under martial law, and suppressed them. Well, a few years later, those Irish Catholics race riot, and they target African Americans in the Lombard Street riots, right near Bethel Church. So we have these Irish Catholics who were victims in their home country of the English come to America, they get victimized again, and then they become the victimizers. And this pattern persists because, of course, the fight is how can we fit into this country and get what we want? And coming from a land, Ireland, where there's mass starvation inflicted by the English government, it's a zero-sum game in the minds of many individuals. And so we see these heightened tensions. And this is tragic because, of course, historically we know, going back into the 17th century, kind of before Bacon's Rebellion and whatnot, that because the Irish and Scots and Welsh were thrown into the indentured servant basket, they often lived alongside with and intermarried with African Americans and Africans in these early times, but they get played against each other, and we get this invented idea of this white race that is the civilized race, and this African race, which is typified by Jim Crow, a happy slave, and Zip Coon, a free idiot. And then other characters that were part of the show, like Brother Tambo, who played the tambourine, and Brother Bones, who played the bones. And it assumes a standard form. And so the minstrel show becomes, in the estimation of many historians, America's first national popular entertainment. And so people are traveling the country performing these minstrel shows. There's the Virginia Minstrels, which was Dan Emmett's group. There's Christie's Minstrels, who persisted till this day, though not in blackface. And other minstrel troupes copying this performance. And besides providing entertainment, for many people, they're providing their entire opinion of who and what African Americans are. And what I mean is, in the broadest sense, as the United States is pushing westward, and by the way, you could do an entire video about Native Americans and a similar phenomenon we inflicted upon them. As Americans are pushing westward and taking native land, these new states, Michigan, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska territory, right? These new states are being settled almost entirely by white people because African people aren't migrating to the U.S. Africans who are here are rare, but African Americans are the most of the population, and about 90% of the African American population are enslaved in the South. And that remnant 10% free black population, by and large, is staying put because they don't get the Homestead Act. The government is not clearing land and giving them free land like they're doing for white settlers. And so these white settlers moving west, they don't encounter real African American people. And so their only idea of who or what an African American is Jim Crow and Zip Coon and Brother Tambo and Brother Bones. And so their idea is, well, these guys. So I don't have to worry about this when I hear some abolitionist come to town or somebody say something. I don't need to worry about it because, you know, I saw that show and everything's cool. Slavery works, and these individuals can't even deal with living in freedom anyway. And so it helps to blunt the momentum of the abolitionist movement, which was growing at this time, but never actually, ever, became a majority of the U.S. population. Most people were either indifferent or actively hostile to abolition in the United States. And in fact, the Free Soil Party that emerges in the 1840s, the Free Soil Party wanted to block the extension of slavery into the new territories. And the argument was not about abolition necessarily. For some it was. but it was about the fact that these new immigrant groups couldn't compete with enslaved labor because they expected to get paid. So we see this show travel around the country, and American culture, American entertainment, if the show wasn't in town, they would have these events. They kind of morphed through the years. We call them the community sings. And so the printing industry emerges, and what the printing industry would do is they'd print the music of the popular entertainer. So you could have the music, and you could, to entertain yourself and your friends or at a party or at a holiday, sing all the songs together. And so if you look at American sheet music, a lot of it printed in Philadelphia, incidentally, by the Curtis Publishing Company, you'll see racist caricatures. A lot of the images you'll see of Jim Crow or the minstrel shows will be either the posters announcing their performance or the sheet music printing their songs. And so Stephen Foster, all of his music that becomes kind of American standard, the anthems of America, is all that. In fact, this is anecdotal, so don't hold this as an absolute truth, but I have read in several sources, but not verified, that even chicken crossing the road jokes were part of the repertoire of minstrel performers and minstrel shows. So we have this abolitionist roadshow pushing this image of happy slaves and discontented and uncivilized free people of color. Now, this brings another kind of cultural racism side note, which is you probably by this point have seen photographs of Frederick Douglass. And there's a reason for that. Frederick Douglass understood the power of image. And so Frederick Douglass chose to have himself photographed repeatedly, and he would always be dressed in like the highest class clothes, and his hair would be done perfectly, because he knew that his image, his appearance as a real living actual black man could serve hopefully as an antidote to the printed cartoonish representations presented on sheet music and in minstrel shows by these minstrel performers. And by 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe was publishing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this gets to my point before about fiction versus reality. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a work of fiction, and yet Uncle Tom's Cabin as a work of fiction did more to to move the needle on the issue of abolition than dozens of true-to-life narratives by the survivors of slavery. And that just tells you where we were as a society. That Frederick Douglass traveling the country and having his like beautiful photographs taken everywhere was not nearly as persuasive as this book written by a white woman recounting, Frederick Douglass, he knew what he was doing, recounting stories that she had heard living in Ohio in an abolitionist family. And in fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe's work would actually go on to provide more fuel for racist stereotypes. There was actually a performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin in New York before the book had even been fully published. It was being serialized. In other words, it was being printed chapter by chapter over a span of time. So before the whole thing was done and published in book form, there was a performance of it in New York because it was so popular. And just to really what a slap in the face, and I'll show you the poster. The person who played the titular character, Uncle Tom, was Thomas Dartmouth Daddy Rice. So yes, the very first actor to perform the role of Uncle Tom was, as the poster says, the original Jim Crow. And so as you can imagine, this Daddy Rice, as a man who had popularized Jim Crow, his presentation of Tom maybe left a lot to be desired, or some to be desired. I don't know. I didn't see it. I'm just drawing conclusions based on the fact that he spends 20 years mocking African Americans, and now he's supposed to represent this patient, saintly martyr character, Uncle Tom. And there'll be more. Just hold on to that. So they would perform and interpret this Uncle Tom's Cabin play, and you would see posted to talk about the comedy in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a tragedy. It's a book of activism about how awful slavery is, and yet it's interpreted on the stage for laughs as well as for drama. People will perform scenes from it. So it moves people. We get through the Civil War. The war ends. And now Jim Crow is not as useful as a character because there is no slave. And so we begin to see a shift in the culture war about African Americans. And this is really what it is. African Americans are fighting for their dignity and equality. And there is this hardcore group of racists and slavers who are fighting to deny the humanity and dignity and equality of African Americans. And they shift gears. And we begin to see these new sorts of characters emerge. And so we'll have the character Sambo. And Sambo had been one of those names given to enslaved men, but now there's the Sambo. And Sambo was a lazy, good-for-nothing, gambling, black man who didn't really want to work and didn't want to do anything, and you had to motivate him and threaten him, and he's constantly fighting with his women, and etc. And of course, as George Frederickson, author of The Black Image and the White Mind, said, he said, you couldn't have seen Sambo. There was no Sambo before the war. Nope, sorry. Yeah. There was no Sambo before the war, or sorry, I take it back. Sambo was great before the war because it showed African Americans lazy. What you couldn't see after the war is these later representations of African American men as kind of prone to rage and violence, because of course that would be disruptive. So happy-go-lucky Jim Crow becomes Sambo, and Jim Crow is no longer an effective character. Sambo becomes kind of the post-freedom Jim Crow character. What I mean is, like, he's the nostalgic look back to those good old days. I have to agree with you, Jay. We see some of these stories going on today. And what we see from post-Civil War period, Uncle Tom's Cabin continues to remain a spectacularly successful stage play. And it brings us a whole new character, Topsy, who was later evolved into a character called the Pickaninny. And so, whereas the minstrel show focused on male characters, we see the emergence of the Mammy, who's the character I covered in my very first video about Aunt Jemima. We see the Mammy emerge. And the emergence of the Mammy character is tied directly to Uncle Tom's Cabin, where there was a Mammy figure who was Uncle Tom's wife. We see the character of the uncle, and we see these representations of these old, submissive African Americans who supposedly kind of understood the system, and we see this whole nostalgic created culture in the South as part of their lost cause lie that is aimed at rehabilitating slavery, because of course, from the point of view of the South, 260,000 men had been killed, and hundreds of thousands more maimed for life, and tens of thousands died of starvation and economic ruin. And if all of that loss was in defense of a system that ultimately was found to be indefensible, that would be unbearable. So they made up a whole new story that, like, it wasn't indefensible, it was actually a great system, and the Northerners came and ruined it. And these men died not in vain, they died to defending our culture, our Southern way of life. And see, Uncle and Auntie, they understand it. It's these new kids coming up. They're the problems. And so the minstrel show actually continues to play post-Civil War. And in fact, notably, going back to issues of intercommunal violence, there are draft riots in New York. And these riots occur in the Lower East Side in the Irish neighborhoods. The Irish riot and attack the draft office because they were being drafted to go fight, many times right off the boat from Ireland, to fight in a war in a country they just got to, and they were pissed, understandably. But after attacking the draft office and the draft enlisting office and burning the draft cards, they then proceeded to attack black neighborhoods, blaming African Americans living in New York for their being drafted into the war. And in part, interestingly, sadly, it was because African Americans weren't allowed to serve as soldiers yet, or they had just started to because it was July 1863. So African Americans had only been enlisted as soldiers from the North for 7 months. So here are these Irish immigrants coming to America and being sent off to fight in defense of African American freedom, and yet African Americans were not being called on to fight. But of course, African Americans were desperate to fight. Frederick Douglass is constantly at the White House badgering Lincoln, telling him to get his act together and do this thing. So we see these complex and just sad, very sad racial tensions playing out in society because they're still here with us. And they go all the way back to these eras and these kind of misunderstandings and these fights and these kind of weird emergences of prejudice and discrimination in our society and this caricatured life. After the Civil War, after Reconstruction ends and Southerners seize control of the states, they seize control of the narrative and they implement segregation laws, which are called Jim Crow laws, named after the character. So hereafter, most of us, when we hear Jim Crow, we think of laws. But it was actually a popular entertainment figure, like Ronald McDonald, that everybody knew who Jim Crow was. And of course, these minstrel shows and these blackface performers continue and persist, and the United States is entering a new era of mass migration. And Americans are worried about these new immigrants coming in, and what happens is these new immigrants begin to read the terrain, and they become the blackface minstrel performers. Being a blackface performer is considered kind of low class. Like, we all like to go to the shows, but, you know, that's something you leave for questionably white people to do. And so a lot of minstrel performers would be Irish. A lot of minstrel performers would be Jewish. And in fact, the most famous white blackface performer, Al Jolson, was Jewish. He was a Lithuanian Jew. I think he was born in America, who changed his name to Al from a much more Hebrew-sounding name, and performed in blackface because that, you know, like, that was an acceptable way for immigrants to perform, because of course high society wasn't accepting of them in theater, right? They weren't performing Shakespeare, and so they weren't in the orchestras, and so they could slap on some black makeup, get up on stage, and attract large audiences. So we have lots of these migrants and immigrants performing in blackface as a means of finding a way of making a living, and also as a way of separating themselves from African Americans who, it was pretty clear from the social cues, were considered, actually social cues from the newspapers and the magazines, were considered the Negro problem. And for example, at the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair in Chicago, the great white city, W.E.B. Du Bois and others, Frederick Douglass, argue that there should be a Negro Day because they were celebrating the great achievements of America over the previous 100 years. And so the World's Fair organizers arranged this Negro Day. And of course, if you look at the ads and the advertisements, it's a collection of mass popular cultural stereotypes. Jokes about making runs on the watermelon stands and whatever. And what's happening is a lot of these stories from Uncle Tom's Cabin are being caricatured and played out, and they are growing into a mass popular racist culture. And this is in the era of mass commercial product advertising. And so advertisers begin to use these caricatures, right? Aunt Jemima debuts at the World's Fair. I talked about in the very first video, selling her pancakes because, of course, we all have an image sold from minstrel shows and by stage performances of Uncle Tom's Cabin of this great cook. That was the aunt, Aunt Dizzy, or Uncle Ben and his rice, or etc. And so we begin to interpret African Americans as these perfect domestic household servants if they're old. If they're the old generation, if they're the aunts and uncles, because the young kids, those Sambos and Zip Coons, those are problematic ones. And there's no Jim Crows because slavery's over. So it becomes a form of popular entertainment and everyone accepts it. And even when they attempt to have a day honoring African American achievement at the World's Fair, the white publishers of leaflets and pamphlets turn it into a farce. That said, Frederick Douglass gives a speech there, and it supposedly kicked a lot of butt because, of course, 1894 is 2 years after the Mississippi Plan, which was the first legal segregation plan, is implemented. And so we still see a lot of contention occurring. African Americans in the 1890s still haven't been shut out of total political power in the South. The North Carolina coup, which overthrew a black-white coalition government in North Carolina, occurs in 1898, which means that there are still opportunities for political achievement and political power in the South. It hasn't been snuffed out yet. And so, again, just like slavery was justified with Jim Crow and minstrel shows, in the 1890s, these blackface performers in vaudeville traveling the country helped justify disenfranchisement and helped justify segregation, and also kind of harken back to this kind of nostalgic sensibility of this supposedly orderly, charming society before mass industrialization and labor unrest and strikes and whatever, which was American society in the 1890s. We go through a massive depression in the 1890s, for example. And so we have these disorienting factors. We have a society in rapid societal change, and so they cling to racial stereotypes and racial ideas and racial beliefs as a means of holding on to a sense of Americanness that was changing rapidly. And as immigrants come into the country, they begin to see that these are the people we need to separate ourselves from. But if you want to get into showbiz, a great way to do it is to make fun of these people. That way I can get a job and I can whatever. Al Jolson even says that he couldn't quite feel free enough as a performer until he had blacked up. And I mean, there's a whole lot of psychological analysis that can go on there. And Fredrickson does it in the video Ethnic Notions. But in short, the phenomenon we today call digital blackface, where people are constantly, usually white people, using memes and GIFs of black people reacting to situations as an example, this is what blackface was. Because, of course, you know, going all the call back to that geohumoral notion, right? To be civilized was to be cold and unemotional. As we know, human beings are neither cold nor unemotional. And so these men, even as they are afraid for their jobs or their livelihoods, or they're going on strike, or they're living in poverty, or they're struggling to make a living or take care of their family, all of these things, they're not allowed to be afraid. They're not allowed to be joyous. They're not allowed to be anything. I mean, there's high levels of alcoholism, right? Because if you get drunk, you can just carry on and act a fool, and it's because you were drunk. Well, you could also put on blackface and act a fool, because then it wasn't you. You're just making fun of black people. You're not actually living out your own needs for emotional expression. You're just impersonating those people who live closer to the equator, thus are more fiery, passionate, angry Othello types. You get the idea, right? And so we see this emergence in this phenomenon. It's in this period in the 1890s that we begin to see African Americans, singers, performers, who realize that they won't be able to get on the stage themselves unless they do it in blackface. And so what we have are these crazy situations where there are black performers who will actually change their names to Irish sounding names and then put on blackface and go up on stage and perform. As Lenny Sloan, the choreographer, puts it in Ethnic Notions, we have a crazy situation where we have performers impersonating their own impersonators impersonating them. And this way, African Americans are able to get their way onto the vaudeville stage, onto the traveling mass popular entertainment of the time. And this is where George Walker and Bert Williams enter the picture. They are both vaudeville performers, but, well, they're not vaudeville performers yet, sorry. They're both performers who want to reach the big time. And they meet each other, and they decide that they're going to form a duo. And they're going to call their duo Two Real Coons. In other words, they're like, look, if people can be making money off blackface, let it be black people. And so Walker and Williams, as they will go by, become this performing duo. And interestingly enough, only Williams would wear the blackface, and Walker wouldn't. And so you'd have the, quote, Two Real Coons, and they basically took the minstrel tradition and the blackface tradition and tried to, tell me if you've heard this before, to reclaim it for African Americans themselves. And they become very successful. By 1901, they're literally in the studios recording Victrolas, recording records of their songs and their singing. Eventually, Walker dies young, and Bert Williams is left behind, and he becomes so popular that he gets a contract with Ziegfeld's Follies, which is the largest vaudeville, most popular vaudeville show in America. And he is one of the highest paid performers in American society at this time. It's the early 1900s. But he's not alone in this, because there is a pair of white sisters, the Duncan Sisters, who will also be a sort of duo. And what I mean is the Duncan Sisters become famous because they will play from the old Uncle Tom's Cabin. They will play Topsy and Ava. And one of the Duncan Sisters will black up and do just ridiculous things to look like basically a monster, not really a black child, but theoretically, supposedly some sort of a, quote, pickaninny. And then her sister would play Ava, the angelic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, saintly child who dies young and who helps turn Topsy into a good girl. And so they would perform this. And so you would have a situation where literally you've got a white performer mocking African Americans, but then a black performer actually performing in blackface in the same show in the same evening. And both of them would eventually make it into the moving pictures. And in fact, just last year, I think, NYU found a copy of an old Bert Williams movie, which was filmed, I believe, in Pennsylvania. I have to check, but I think it was filmed. It might have been filmed out in Montgomery County. But he goes into moving pictures, and he's performing these caricatures, and he's acting as these African American characters. By this point, you know, we're going on 70 years of blackface performance. It's just standard. People are just like, well, yeah, black people gamble a lot, and they like to play with razors, and they like to steal chickens. That was Topsy. And all this other nonsense that has accumulated over decades. It's basically racist cultural baggage that accumulates with these performers. And Bert Williams will have a career through the silent films, and he eventually dies an alcoholic. in part because the daily, what we will today call microaggressions, but even then they weren't particularly micro, some of them were pretty macro, but the daily indignities he suffered because he was traveling with this famous white troupe performing for white audiences mocking African Americans. But nonetheless, as he was more and more in the movie business, he slowly eliminated racist material, more overtly racist, and just kind of became like a slapstick Charlie Chaplin-esque comedian towards the end of his life. But he died from alcohol poisoning. And nonetheless, the Duncan sisters persist, and as we know, Al Jolson is performing in blackface. And by the time we get to the talkies, the talking movies, the very first talking movie is The Jazz Singer starring Al Jolson. So we can't even pretend that blackface wasn't a thing because this watershed motion picture, this talking motion picture, featured a Jewish Lithuanian immigrant performing in blackface. And obviously, there are lots of movies featuring actors in blackface. The very first, most traumatic was Birth of a Nation, which inspired the very first mass protest movement by the NAACP. That was about 12 years earlier. That was a silent film, but that actually featured black performers as well as blackface actors. And just to give you a sense, the more racially like the attempted rape, basically, of Lillian Gish, her character. The attempted rape scene was done by a black-faced actor because either they didn't trust black actors or black actors refused to participate in a racial stereotype that black men want to rape white women, which again, of course, explains why Othello still would not be performed in the US because Othello strangles Desdemona. So we have the movie industry in blackface and the first talking movie in blackface. And through the decades, Judy Garland would perform in blackface. Shirley Temple would perform in blackface. I mean, it's so standard that there's a veritable who's who of actors you may have heard of in the 1920s and 30s who at one point performed on stage in blackface. But Shirley Temple, to her credit, or maybe because she was such a young child, she has one of the kind of most famous controversial scenes, which today we wouldn't even notice it. She does a tap dance routine with Bill Bojangles Robinson in one film, and she actually holds his hand. And at the time, this was considered a risky move on her part, to have a white girl holding the hand of a black man as they danced together. And it's all crazy. It is all crazy. We see the emergence of animation, and of course cartoons would draw African Americans as these caricatured, black-faced African Americans. We see a continuation of all of the advertising stereotypes. And so what we have by, say, 1930s is a massive material culture, objects, clocks, banks, toys, advertisements, mascots, whatever, featuring these black caricatures. It is a part of everyday American life. If you go back to the Aunt Jemima video, I'm not going to show it to you now, I'm going to make you watch Aunt Jemima if you haven't seen it. I have one of those items, in fact, and it is a standard thing. There's a famous picture of Governor Al Smith of New York at a kind of Democratic Party dinner in New York, one of these annual fundraising dinners, and the entire Supreme Court of New York, the Democratic justices, are all in blackface and wearing these outlandish costumes. It became not only accepted, but expected. This was just American popular culture. And that's why when Paul Robeson performs as Othello in 1940, it is an incredibly dramatic moment because he's performing when they're still making horrifying racist cartoons, when there's still characters called Step and Fetch It, Molasses in January, Amos and Andy on the radio. There are still all of these ridiculous racist shows and performances carrying on because that is just what American entertainment was. And all of this, through the decades, as it emerges and morphs over time, has always served one purpose. And that one purpose has always been to diminish African American aspirations for equality, to nullify the force and strength of African American critiques of American society, to serve as an antidote to racist notions. And so we see this cultural racist system that is more than 100 years deep. And as we know, we continue to see people, right, who will do blackface. One of the saddest things that happens is when I teach African American history, when I get to this part of the class, I'll always make a remark about, like, it still happens today, and then right in front of my class, I'll do a quick Google search. And usually it's about, in the spring anyway, it's like March or April. Sometime in March or April, at some college in America, usually a college, but not always, there was some fraternity or some sports team party or whatever where people put on blackface up to this day. And so a lot of people don't understand why it's such a painful reality, because it became so normalized in American life. And that's kind of part of the point. What we have done with blackface and these ongoing cultural artifacts and relics and cultural, I mean, Aunt Jemima just went away 3 months ago or 4 months ago, right? I mean, like 4 months ago, they were like, yeah, maybe having a big mammy character as your syrup mascot is just not a good idea. Or having Uncle Ben be your rice guy, right? That's just a few months ago. But the reason why so many people can't understand why it's painful is because it became normalized. But the insidious aspect of that is what that means is that African American pain is normalized. American society, going all the way back to the Jim Crow character that said slavery was awesome, using the instruments of popular culture, made pain and mockery of African Americans a normal feature of American cultural life. And this is kind of what we're trying to get at and get out. Because, of course, you go into the 1970s and we get these blaxploitation movies, and, right, I mean, there's an ongoing and forever reality here. And just like Frederick Douglass would constantly have himself photographed to be an antidote to that racist notion, there was a parallel black cinema that developed in the 19-teens and 20s, and the famous director Oscar Micheaux made multiple movies featuring all black casts that dealt with dramatic things and dealt with reality and dealt with some hard issues, but nonetheless featured African Americans as human beings, not as caricatures worthy of mockery, whose aspirations to full equality and participation in American life could be ignored. And so, like I said, this is very broad, and I'm going to be throwing up links and links and links and links for you all. From movie posters to the Duncan Sisters to Jim Crow to the Christie Minstrels to black memorabilia to black photography. Individuals could do an entire course, 14-week college course, reading multiple books on all the various aspects of cultural racism in the United States directed at African Americans. And understand that there is cultural racism directed at other people, of course, right? I mean, we're still trying to get rid of the racist names of baseball and football teams. And I'll point out, incidentally, the Atlanta Braves started in Boston, where they were the Boston Braves, and the former Washington team because they got rid of their name, also started in Boston. And so these anti-Native American things all seem to be in Boston. Um, and we were lucky we didn't have a similar phenomenon with African Americans, but it seems to be the one area where African Americans were not caricatured, but they were also not included until Jackie Robinson and others. So, yeah. So this is a very deep history. I hope I've given you a sense of kind of the contours and kind of the flow of the story and how these things emerged and developed. And if it's something you're interested in, I hope you'll kind of follow on some of the links that I'm providing to you and read more and watch more documentaries, because this is an incredibly deep topic. Yeah, exactly, Nicole. Nicole is saying, for those of you who aren't looking at comments, that she saw a photo of a school principal in blackface on Facebook this morning. Right? We don't know our history. We don't understand the depths of pain in that situation. We don't understand that all of this material culture, this cultural racism, this mockery, this minstrel performance, all of that was aimed at solidifying in the mindset of everyday Americans, the people not reading the scientific books, right? That it was aimed to solidify in their minds, these people are below you. And so if we deny them the right to vote, if we don't let them come into the same park as you're allowed into, if we make them go in the back door, if we come up with a restaurant, there was a restaurant in the 1920s called the Coup Chicken Inn from Salt Lake City and Seattle and Portland. It was in the Northwest, right? Coup Chicken Inn. If we can do all this, you don't need to worry about it. And, of course, what makes it worse is we know that during these decades, there is incredible amounts of racial violence. There are racial massacres, the complete extermination of entire black towns, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Rosewood in Florida, right? And if all of that is happening, it might be a little shocking. But if you've been bombarded from childhood with all these images, I'll get your question, Mary Beth. If you've been bombarded for decades with all these images, you're like, oh, that's regrettable. And you can set it aside and not worry about it. You can make it not an actionable item, not something you'd vote on or not something you'd worry about, because these are not my people. I don't worry about them. And also, they're happy, or slavery isn't a big deal, or they're kind of dangerous, so we should be locking them up. Because they're always playing with razor blades and playing with guns and black on black crime, right? We see manifestations of it even today, obviously. But know that the reason why it's so hard to unwind is because it is so deeply rooted in the deep history of this country. And not enough people know the true history of this country. Well, not know the true history, know the full history of this country. They don't know all of these details and all of these realities and all of these forces that have manifested in American life. All of the abuse heaped upon people. All of the cultural racism. They just see it as, well, yes, but black on black crime. It's like, yeah, okay, yeah, right? It's the same thing over and over again. And so as we sit in this place in this year where racial issues emerge very powerfully, although have, again, kind of retreated back, we have to keep in mind this doesn't go away in a few months, because it wasn't built in a few months. It was built over decades and decades of constant reinforcement, right? The sort of constant reinforcement that has Kenneth Clark with his doll studies, having black children look at a white doll and a black doll, and when being asked to pick which doll is the bad doll, they pick the black doll, even though they are black children, right? This happens because of a saturation of American life, a saturation of culture. Scientific racism is insidious and dangerous, right? Nazi Germany showed us this. But even Nazi Germany, they could not have accomplished what they did in terms of Holocaust and massacres if it wasn't for the pre-existing cultural racism against Jewish people that already existed. The culturally pre-existing anti-Semitism. And so scientific racism is kind of the action item based on a very broad and deep cultural system of racism, categorization, snap judgments, material culture, music, songs, movies, films, storybooks, characters. I mean, it is just everywhere around us. And it enables human beings to look the other way when horrific crimes are committed, when injustice is perpetrated, and when a society that said all men are created equal does not actually manifest that in its policies. So I'm going to call it a day, and I'm going to start posting. Look in the comment section after this is over, because there's going to be so much stuff. Even as I'm talking, I'm thinking of all these other things I could have been telling you. I had to make choices, so forgive me. I thought it was important to learn about Ira Aldridge, for that matter, and to make it Jersey local with some Paul Robeson, who also lived in West Philly. I actually used to work in Paul Robeson's house back in grad school for the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, so I have a special affection for him, and all these other things. But understand on the flip side that as much as there's all of that racist culture and whatever, maybe that's what I'll do next week. Yeah. American culture as it exists today, in the positive sense, does not exist as it exists today without African Americans. So that even though there's all of this negative stuff that is there, what we have that is positive would not be what it is without African Americans either. So culture is a very complex phenomenon for sure. So anyway, look for the links. If anyone has any questions, I'll wait a few seconds. I know someone said they're going to ask me a question, so I'll look for that later. And I will see you next week. Whew. Yeah, that was a lot, huh? I always have to do that kind of sighing exhalation because it's all so vast. Alrighty, everyone. Have a beautiful evening or a beautiful rest of your day. Doesn't look like the sun's going to come out today here in Philly, but be a nice day anyway. And take a look at some of the things I'm posting. If you get a chance, watch some of these documentaries. They are not just good, they're good, and they're not just necessarily like drawing a curtain back on something ugly, but some of them are downright inspiring. The one on black photography and photographers is where I first kind of came across that notion of Frederick Douglass and his very clear decision to have himself photographed as an antidote to Jim Crow caricatures. So, all right, my friends, until next time, enjoy all that is good in life, because otherwise there's no reason to live. Take care, and I'll see you soon.